One of the most nerve-wracking things any car guy or girl will do is to prepare an engine for its first startup after a fresh rebuild. There's a checklist of things you can do to make sure you're successful doing it, and I'll show you how I run through that checklist. Now, the whole idea on initial startup is not to get things set perfectly before you get to that point. It's to get it to where it just is running. Perfect is not your goal here. You're just trying to make sure that it instantly starts, you've got good fuel, you've got good oil, and you got pressure, timing is set correctly. All of those things are super critical, but don't shoehorn yourself into thinking that everything has to be set perfectly. You're not going to be able to tune that carburetor perfectly right out of the box unless it was already tuned for that engine before you start working on it. That's okay. It's just getting it running. That's all you need to concern yourself with. So don't get bogged down in detail. Don't keep beating yourself up and spending a lot of time stressing about it and being overly concerned about all the little details. Just get it to where it's running. Initial startup is just that. We're just trying to help the valve train get itself worn in on that initial wear and all the little things that need to occur to make sure that all those metals that come in contact with each other with that little barrier of oil, all of those things are good long term. And this happens to be a hydraulic roller camshaft engine, so it's a little bit different as far as how the break-in procedure is concerned, but make no mistake about it, you have to break in a hydraulic roller engine. We'll talk about that procedure very, very detailed in another video, but today I just want to cover the basics of what you need to do to make sure that this thing is set correctly, so when you hit the key, you fire up pretty immediately. You don't want it cranking over for 10-15 seconds before it finally lights off, or you're monkeying with a lot of things. You're just trying to get this to where you get it running, you get that initial 30-minute break-in done, then you can go back and start doing your tuning and really dialing in the timing and all those little important details. So keep that in mind going through this. We're just trying to get it in the really close ballpark. All the other fine tuning is going to be done after the fact. Now let's first talk about timing. And if you degreed in your cam, and absolutely yes, you should be degreeing in every single camshaft you put into an engine, you already know where top dead center is. You've already marked your balancer, so those are set in there correctly. When you drop in the distributor and you know and you've verified where TDC is and you're sure that you're lined up there, dropping in the distributor shouldn't be that big of a deal. Line it up with the number one cylinder, make sure that it's in there correctly, you're engaged with the fuel pump, the oil pump, and you should be good to go. You see a lot of times where folks will say, I just dropped in the distributor on the startup and looks like I'm 180 degrees out. Should never run into that issue on an initial startup. And that's all just making sure that take your time, make sure you're at TDC, get the distributor dropped in there correctly, and then when you go to do your initial startup, it may require just a little bit of a turn one way or another to advance or retard the timing to get it to fire, but it should fire very quickly within just a couple of seconds of hitting the key. So timing is obviously a very critical piece to this. We'll move on to the carburetor next. Now, before you install, if you're selecting a new carburetor, here's where it is very, very critical that you get the CFM size correct before you even try to start this thing up and realize, oops, I think I bought one that's too big, which is typically the case, or sometimes too small. Make sure you get the right CFM. There's nothing you can do if you jack this one up. Will you be able to get it started and running? Yeah, but it's probably going to make it a little bit more complicated. And anything you can do to make this process easier certainly will help reduce your stress a little bit. But checking the floats, even if it's a brand new carburetor, even if it's one like this one that I rebuilt here recently, I will still pop the top off of it or pop the bowls off and verify that I have the float set correctly. Very, very critical piece. You want to make sure that it's getting the right amount of fuel in there. Check the needle and seats, make sure there's nothing in there, make sure that everything operates good, and then go ahead and preset the idle mixture screws. Again, this one is not one that you have to monkey around with too much. On an Edelbrock, turn and a half. Holley, turn and a half. On a 4-corner distributor, maybe you're only 3/4 of a turn. Find the right setting for it, and then don't worry about it too much. Just getting it set is all you need to do at this point. The fuel pressure regulator is important in this setup on your initial startup, but really not as critical as you may think. You just need to make sure that the carburetor is getting enough pressure to keep the engine running. And sometimes if that means, like on this one, I had this one set on the engine before, so I know that the pressure is pretty dialed in, but I am still going to back it out a little bit and make sure that it is getting a little bit more pressure than it probably should. I'd rather have too much fuel than be too lean and starve it and kill the engine. So you can always, on initial startup, once you get it running, you can always double check that gauge really quick and make some adjustments on the fly. But just make sure that it's got enough pressure to keep it running. There's no way you're going to be able to preset this at that 6 psi on an Edelbrock or 6.5, 7 on a Holly. It's just not going to happen. So just make sure you've got enough pressure to keep the thing running. Fluids is one that gets a little bit neglected. Obviously, you're going to put a good break-in oil in there. You're going to make sure that the fluid level is right on that. You're going to make sure that you topped off the filter if you can pre-fill the filter as well. Coolant's another one that sometimes you're going to have some air bubbles in that system. If you run a little hot on break-in, it's not horrible, but give yourself that opportunity to make sure that when as the engine's running, you can actually throw some coolant in there if you need to before you throw the cap back on there. Transmission fluid is a big one. This is a 700 R4, and certainly it is a brand new build. Brand new converter, brand new transmission. That one is going to be critical. That one on initial startup is very important that you start adding fluid in there. You don't want to starve the pump and cause so many issues. Fuel is one that I think is part of the neglected side of it. Pre-fill the fuel bowls on the carburetor before you go to the initial start. Now, I know that sounds like, well, I'll just dump a little bit of gas or throw some starting fluid down the Venturi, it'll be fine. Please do not do that. Ether and starting fluid is not good for the engine. It's not good for the lubrication on the cylinder walls. Don't use it. If you get fuel within the fuel bowls, the carburetor will start to meter fuel the way it's supposed to, and you'll have no problem. So go ahead and pre-fuel the fuel bowls. Before you try to start at that initial time, make sure you got power to the starter, distributor, alternator. Make sure the battery's fully charged up. Just the little details. Where are you going to need power? Make sure you've got power. It's a quick way just to verify that everything's right and give yourself as many opportunities to do this successful on that first key start. So again, you're just trying not to make it perfect. You're just trying to make sure you got power that you need and you're ready to roll when you hit the key. Let's talk about priming the engine, and this one's going to ruffle a few feathers, so I'm going to try to make this as clear and as concise as I can. On priming the engine, the only thing that I will do is with the battery, with the distributor disconnected, I will rotate the engine over with the starter just to make sure that I show oil pressure on the gauge, and that is it. Once I get there, I do not go any further. If you take a priming tool, cut up distributor and drop it in there and prime the engine for 10 or 15 minutes because you just want to make sure it's getting good oil cycled through there, what you are doing on a fresh rebuild is wiping away all of that break-in assembly lube that you put on all those bearings. That is its job. Primary initial startup is to make sure that you have got the correct amount of lubrication on there to make sure that thing wears in correctly. If you prime the engine forever and keep rotating it over to make sure it hits all the bearings and doing all those things, you are going to wash all that away. Do not spend a ton of time doing a long prime on a fresh rebuild. That's why you used assembly lube putting it together. If it's done right and it's still there, it's all you need. You don't need to run this thing for 10-15 minutes to prime it. We'll do another video on that down the road, but this is it. Just a very brief, make sure you got oil pressure, and that's all you need. Now let's talk about on startup. Now there's some things that you have to do prior to that, and that is doing your research on your valve train. Engine RPM for break-in, initial break-in, is not the same for every engine. It's not the same for every valve train. Do your research. Make sure you know what the proper break-in RPM is and the procedure is. If you're on a big heavy valve train like a big block Chevy and you try to run this thing at 2500, I guarantee you're going to run into some problems. Seen this a number of times, especially in the camshaft video that we did at the first of the year of why camshafts fail. You just have to do your research on what type of valve train you're going to work with and what it needs. If the spring pressures need to change and you need to run a lighter spring for break-in, don't skip that. It's a big part of making sure that all that is done properly and the thing survives. Make sure lash is set correctly. Distributor was dropped into place properly. You know, if it's a flat tappet cam, it's going to require a different type of break-in procedure than a roller cam. It's all good. Having an underhood tachometer and oil pressure gauge are really super critical if you're doing this alone. But if you got a friend that can help you with it, the underhood tach is a good one. You don't need to. I have one on my timing light. We're not setting timing here, but it is a nice, quick, easy way to look at it. When you hit the key and everything starts happening, oil pressure is the first thing that you need to look at. Hopefully it'll light off really quickly. If you need to turn the distributor just a hair or two to get it to run, it shouldn't be that bad. You've already done all the correct things and done your due diligence before you started all this. It shouldn't take more than just a couple of cranks, a couple of seconds at the most for this thing to fire off and to get running. So oil pressure is quickly. Take a look at fuel pressure really quickly. If you're an automatic transmission guy or girl and this is a brand new transmission in there, you need to make sure you start adding fluid quickly. You do not want to dry that thing out and burn the pump out. Automatic transmission is super critical in this process. Obviously, you're going to listen for any, odd noises, and sometimes this is a little easy to do, and sometimes this is hard to do. So having some friends there to help you kind of do all these things in that quick time period is a good thing. Look for any major oil leaks or fluid leaks underneath the vehicle. Again, another good reason to have somebody kind of help you. If you need to add fluid, coolant to the thing, get it in there quickly. Temperature starts to rise, especially on a new break-in, and you want to get that thing sealed up. It's probably not going to be perfect. That's okay, as long as it's got a majority of the fluid in there. You may have a little bit of air in there. You're just trying to get this as close as possible. Get an infrared gun. Make sure that you start checking the tubes on it. If you've got one that's really cold and you know it's not firing, then you know you got an issue. You've got a problem with the valves not opening, your latch wasn't set correctly. There's a dozen reasons why. The distributor's not plugged in all the way on that spark plug or on that terminal on the distributor. You just need to be cautious of that. And really, after that first minute or two, everything kind of falls into place. Go through your normal break-in procedure for the length of time, and then depending on the valve train, and you should be good to go. After your initial break-in, now's a really good time to do an oil analysis. Now we're going to do a separate video on that, and we take the oil sample out of here and send it off to Speed Diagnostics to see what exactly the baseline is. It'll tell us how much it wore, what type of other chemicals are present, how things wore as far as the oil went. We're using a Driven Racing oil. That's a Lake Speed company there on the Speed Diagnostics. He knows that product really well. It's a very good one to do. Change the oil anyway. You need to change it after your initial and put break-in fluid back in there for the certain amount of time that you need to have it in there. Now again, that's going to come down to the rings, and call the ring manufacturer. Do your research there. Don't rely on your third cousin's Uncle Rico, because he's done hundreds of these things, and to tell you exactly how much time you need on it, because chances are Uncle Rico doesn't know what's going on. Rely on the manufacturer. Let them tell you. If they tell you that it needs 250 miles on a break-in, then run it 250. If it needs 400 on break-in oil for the rings to fully seat in, then run it 400. Don't guess here. Don't play the guessing game or the internet game. Call the manufacturer. They're the subject matter expert. They're the ones that can tell you exactly how long it needs to be done for. And then do all the normal things after the initial break-in. Check the headers, check the cylinder heads, manifolds, headers, converters if you're an automatic guy or girl. Check the flywheel bolts. Just all those critical things. Harmonic balancers, another good one. Just verify that all those the hardware's still secure on there, and you're good to go. I know initial break-in is kind of one of those stressful things, and it should be, but it also shouldn't be. If you do it correctly, if you take the time to hit through a checklist, make your own if you want, but make sure you cover all the major topics and all the things that you need to kind of look at. And once you do that, and once you get to that point where you hit the key, it should all go very smoothly. If it doesn't, well, you need to go backtrack and figure out what you did wrong or what you didn't get right, and it's all on you at that point. It's your responsibility to go back and find all the details and make sure you got it right. And if you did get it all right, which chances are you will, then the break-in process goes very smoothly. It's not as dramatic as it should be, but you're always going to be a little bit nervous. I've done this for almost 35 years, and every single time I fire up a new engine, sure, I get a little puckered up a little bit thinking about it, but should go fairly smoothly. If you got any questions about this one, don't hesitate to leave them down below. I'd love to answer them for you. If you thought the video was cool and you got something out of it, please leave me a thumbs up. Definitely appreciate that as well, and we'll catch you on the next one. We'll see you.